And now turning to our program, please welcome Corey Zetz, Executive Director of the Menominee Valley Partners, to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon. It is my honor to introduce today's guest speaker, my friend, and our newly returned Rotarian, Adam Tindall-Schlicht. An internationally recognized policy leader and transportation executive, Adam Tindall-Schlicht has served as sector leader for ports, transportation, and infrastructure at Ramble since 2025. In this role, he advises public and private sector clients on planning and delivering climate-smart infrastructure and sustainable transportation strategies across the United States and Canada. Adam served from 2018 to 2022 as director of Port Milwaukee, where he oversaw operations generating more than $100 million in annual economic activity and delivered nationally recognized public-private partnerships and capital projects that transformed our city's industrial waterfront. In 2022, he was appointed by U.S. President Joe Biden as the 11th administrator of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation. As an executive at the U.S. Department of Transportation, Adam oversaw binational maritime operations, federal capital programs, and stakeholder coordination across the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway system. He also spearheaded the Green Shipping Corridor Network, a landmark U.S.-Canada initiative to accelerate the transition to low and zero-emission shipping across the region. Adam currently serves on several regional planning and conservation boards by appointment of Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers, including the Southeast Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, SewerPAC, the Great Lakes Commission, the Council of Great Lakes Region, and the Great Lakes Observing System. Fun fact, Adam's likeness appears as a character in Katie Meyer's children's book, Gust, celebrating Port Milwaukee's wind turbine and maritime environmental stewardship on the Great Lakes. So get a copy if you've got kids and see Adam in that. And his wedding to his husband, Aaron, was featured in the New York Times. Adam and Aaron are raising their young daughter, Camille, in Milwaukee's Bayview neighborhood. Please join me in welcoming Adam Tindall-Schlicht.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. It is truly a pleasure to return as a speaker here at the Rotary Club. The last time I spoke would have been in 2018 or 2019 when I had just become Milwaukee's port director. And at that time, I was able to share some of the vision that we had of what our industrial waterfront could look like. And today I'm going to share reflections on how we were able to take some of these best case and really unique examples of what we're doing here in Milwaukee Harbor and translate them across the Great Lakes region in the Biden-Harris administration. So to begin, for those that haven't heard of the small federal agency that I've led on behalf of the President and the Vice President, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation is one of 27 government corporations within the U.S. federal government. Government corporations act as quasi-federal business-like entities that serve as a nexus between a traditional regulating role and a more trade development or facilitating role against markets that the U.S. government feels are important to target or to uniquely support. We're housed under the U.S. Department of Transportation, so upon my appointment, I reported directly to then Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg and served as a member of his cabinet, not only as one of his premier or primary maritime advisors, but his primary Great Lakes policy advisor, as well as his U.S. and Canada diplomatic advisor. The staff that I oversaw was one of the smaller federal agencies within DOT. In all of DOT, including the FAA, there's probably 55,000 employees nationwide, of which 150 are dedicated solely on Great Lakes related issues. Many of them are based at DOT headquarters in Washington, D.C., where I was based for my federal service. And we also have an office in Messina, New York, which is about an hour and a half west of Montreal on the US side of upstate New York. And you'll hear me talk more about the North Country and why Messina is a very special place for me as a previous administrator of the St. Lawrence Seaway. And again, you'll hear me talk more about the unique role that I had in Canadian diplomatic relations. The St. Lawrence Seaway, since it's opened to commercial vessel traffic in 1959, is jointly administered on a daily basis between representatives of the US and Canadian governments. It is a daily operational partnership that I'll explore in future slides. So that international partnership, as I said, while the Seaway formally opened in 1959, plans for its opening go back to the 1920s, and construction on the now 15-lock system in earnest really began in 1954. But in the day-to-day practice of that international partnership, overseeing Great Lakes policy, the operations of the Seaway, there's so many different partners that come into play in that work. Working with federal officials in Canada like Transport Canada, working with provincial government in Ontario and Quebec, ports on both sides of the border, carriers. At the end of the day, we look to the Great Lakes both as a local resource, but as a shared corridor celebrated between two countries and hundreds of thousands and millions of people. For me, the decision to leave the port, a job that I cherished, was not an easy one. But to be a part of this partnership, this daily practice between two countries, as exemplified at its opening with Queen Elizabeth and President Eisenhower, it was more than a symbolic choice for me. It was one where I could be a leader in the operating, in the practical and essential partnership between our two countries that is a grand legacy of the Great Lakes today. The locks themselves remain in their current form. So when you look at Milwaukee Harbor, when you look at the Port of Milwaukee and you see ships that have come from abroad, in order for that ship to reach Milwaukee, it traverses through 4 of the 5 Great Lakes, including 15 man-made structures, locks. The Seaway locks are 770 feet long, 80 feet wide, and 30 feet deep. The same locks that were built in 1954 to 1959 are in constant continual use today. Those locks allow for 40 million tons of cargo to come and go from vessels around the world into various ports in the US and Canada on the Great Lakes. And I'll show more here. This map shows just a handful of the major ports that are operating on both sides of the border today. When you look at the Great Lakes economy, one of the honors of my service was to tell the story of why this economy is so important. The Great Lakes today, as it has for a long time, constitutes the 3rd largest economy in the world, behind only that of the US and Canada, constituting a $6 trillion contribution on an annual basis. And there's a handful of industries that are heavily dependent on the operation of the maritime industry indicated on this map. When you consider all of the vessel activity on the Great Lakes, not just the foreign flag activity that will come through the St. Lawrence Seaway, but those US flag vessels and those Canadian flag vessels that are built solely to operate within the Great Lakes themselves, 140 million tons of cargo is handled in and around the Great Lakes on an annual basis. So that's a bit of a primer about what the Seaway is and what the Great Lakes economy looks like today from a maritime industrial perspective. With my time remaining, I'm going to highlight some of the work that we did and why I think it's important for a legacy going forward on the Great Lakes. I made mention of a small community called Messina, New York, and over the last 20 years of my career, I've been able to go to Messina on basically a monthly basis, and it is a very small community of maybe 3,000 people 8 hours north of New York City. Again, the closest major urban center is across the border, with Montreal being about an hour and a half away. But this is where two of the locks are, the US-controlled locks, Eisenhower and Snell. And the amount of pride that the Seaway staff, that the Great Lakes federal employees have in operating those locks safely is one that has endured for these 70 years. And I want to acknowledge, though they can't hear us, the workforce of the Seaway on both sides of the border, and certainly in Messina itself. As our county executive, David Crowley, recently announced, today is Worker Justice Day in Milwaukee. And one of the achievements that I'm most proud about as administrator was our ability to renegotiate in trust, in earnest, and in fairness with our unionized workforce at the Seaway, a new 4-year agreement which protects their contributions and keeps management accountable for their health and safety on the job while operating these locks. So I'm very proud of that work. And I'm proud to say that that agreement is still holding in force on the Great Lakes, even given the current geopolitical climate. But this photo is another area that we were able to work on. During my tenure as administrator, we secured funding from Congress to build a new $8 million publicly available, federally operated museum in Messina. And when I tell you that this part of the world is due for tourism money and for a lot more visitors to help support the reindustrialization and reculturalization of what is a difficult part of New York to get to, we know that this visitor center is going to be a catalyst. So it has become a source of local pride. And for those of you that are ever going to Montreal or going to Ottawa, Syracuse, all of these are places where you now have a brand new, free-to-you, gorgeous museum that we are proud to, again, get congressional funding from both Democrats and Republicans to fund. We built it, we constructed it, we opened it, and she's in operation today on a full-time basis. A legacy of shipping on the Great Lakes has to be improving safety, and this was an item that I and my predecessors have focused on through implementation of new IT systems that have dramatically improved vessel performance on the Great Lakes. Over the years, the Seaway system in both the US and Canada have worked to require and implement new technologies to improve how vessels operate on the Great Lakes. Examples include what are now standard practices like the GPS system and the automatic identification system. During my tenure, we sought to advance that into the AI age with development of a new tool, which we hope the Trump administration will continue on, called the Voyage Information System, which provides ship transit information for any vessel coming into the Great Lakes. In this case, let's say a ship is coming carrying steel from Antwerp to the port of Milwaukee. That system would provide real-time information about the vessel so it can make decisions not only from a safety perspective, but also from a climate-smart perspective, meaning that decisions that the captain and the pilot will make about the speed of the vessel, where it is in the ocean, where it is on the St. Lawrence River, where it is on Lake Michigan, all of that can be predetermined and updated in real time over what is probably a 20 or so day voyage from, in this hypothetical, Antwerp to Milwaukee. Implementation of VIS and other IT systems to continue this legacy of vessel safety improvement on the Great Lakes continue today. Certainly, one of the hallmarks of our service in the Biden-Harris administration was the passage and implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS Act. And here you can see a photo with me and my then boss, Pete Buttigieg, Transport Secretary, former Port Milwaukee Director, my successor, the great Jackie Q. Carter, and Agricultural Secretary for Wisconsin, Randy Romanski. I can tell you in working with Secretary Pete that his commitment to the Great Lakes region was visceral and real. Choosing to prioritize highlighting projects and stories and economies in the heartbeat of the Great Lakes was a conversation that the Secretary and I had on nearly a weekly basis. and seeing him proudly come to Milwaukee and tour multiple Great Lakes ports and multiple Great Lakes communities to highlight the work of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act has been, for me, it was a singular experience. I would argue that these legislative tools led to new investments across the Great Lakes region, not just from a port modernization perspective, but from an overall resiliency coastline perspective, tying the economy to the environment through smart investments. For example, these maps show this sheer enormity of what we are able to do with our 4 years. In short, because of these legislative tools, 46,000 infrastructure projects were approved for implementation in a 4-year period. And that includes 1,000 waterway or maritime specific projects nationwide. The lower map shows just some of those ports, including Milwaukee, that received supplemental funding because of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. You will have seen in the news that, I'll talk about it here again, one of the success stories of our port in recent years has been the construction of the agricultural terminal, the DeLong facility on Jones Island. We proudly added $15 million of funds to that facility because it has been such a success story for Wisconsin farmers seeking to export their goods worldwide out of Milwaukee. So right now, Benji Tim, our new port director, Corey's fabulous husband, is implementing that second round of funds to improve and expand the capacity, which has already been really, really great here in Milwaukee. One thing you're going to see across the Great Lakes in recent years, in forthcoming years, is a renewal of the fleet. And I want to give great credit to our senator, U.S. Senator Tammy Baldwin. The senator worked very hard in a bipartisan way to pass what is called the Great Lakes Winter Maritime Commerce Act, which not only requires operational improvements by the U.S. Coast Guard to ensure safety and efficiency improvements for U.S. Great Lakes ports through the Coast Guard, but also serves as a catalyst for funding a new fleet of carbon-friendly vessels that are either operating in a net zero or near net zero way throughout the Great Lakes region. As Seaway Administrator, we were able to use that and replace our fleet of tugboats. The Seaway has long operated with one tugboat, who we called the Robinson Bay. She is 75 years old and past her prime, and we were able to buy and, frankly, fully engineer 2 new carbon-neutral vessels that currently operate on the St. Lawrence River between the U.S. and Canada. These are the Seaway Guardian and the Seaway Trident. And I will add, what do you do with a 75-year-old vessel? Freshwater vessels can operate well past 100 years with regular maintenance. And one of the decisions that I made quite proudly was to donate the Robinson Bay, and she is now home at the Great Lakes Maritime Academy in Traverse City, Michigan, where she is a free training tool for the next generation of sailors on the Great Lakes. So next time you're in Traverse City, take a look out for the Great Robbie Bay. You've already heard me talk a little bit about our movement and our support for carbon neutrality in the maritime supply chain on the Great Lakes. And advancing decarbonization in a binational Great Lakes system that constitutes 10 states and provinces, countless towns, villages, and cities, really requires a convening by industry and government together to have conversations about how do we make sure that vessels like the Algoma Bear that you see here, one of the newest vessels operating on the Great Lakes, she has come to Milwaukee in the past, can look at the entirety of the supply chain and make sure that fuel use moves to carbon neutrality, that vessel construction and operation moves to carbon neutrality, that operations of the ports throughout the Great Lakes on both sides of the border can move towards carbon neutrality. How do we make smart investments in the infrastructure itself, the dock walls, the rail, all of these small elements at ports like Milwaukee that turns Jones Island almost into a tiny city? That requires a huge buy-in by an array of stakeholders. And I'll tell you more in a second about how we were able to do that. But at the end of the day, for a system as complicated and as important as the Great Lakes, we focused on practical pathways to make sure that low and zero emission targets were implementable now and going forward through 2050 throughout the Great Lakes region. See one of the Viking cruise ships coming into Duluth Harbor under their famous bridge. But one of the signature moments that we were able to achieve in the administration was through the United Nations. Each year, the UN does a climate gathering called COP, and at COP 27, the Great Lakes region was approved by the governments of the world as a green shipping corridor. This is the formal designation by the UN and the world's governments as highlighting the Great Lakes as an important economic and environmental system of international and global significance, but B, providing those resources and tools to make sure that the baselines, the performance, and indeed all of the other elements that you need to advance adaptation and adoption of decarbonization in the Great Lakes region are there from a world government perspective. I was proudly the person that President Biden and Secretary Pete asked to lead the Green Shipping Corridor effort on the Great Lakes. I will say with some regret, however, that given the current geopolitical situation, that Green Shipping Corridor work has basically come to a halt at this time in the Great Lakes from a U.S. government perspective. That being said, I continue to engage with incredible partners at the municipal level. Our own Mayor Cavalier Johnson is an executive team member of the Great Lakes Cities Initiative, which represents 450 municipalities, towns, and villages throughout the Great Lakes. Our own Governor, Tony Evers, is the former chair of the Great Lakes Governors Association, and industry. These are all tools and organizations that are continuing the conversation on decarbonization of the Great Lakes region right now, including some amazing Milwaukee and Wisconsin-based leaders, while there is an absence of commitment for this work in Washington, D.C. Returning to the economics of the Great Lakes, one of the things that the bipartisan infrastructure law did for the first time in U.S. history was establish a new supply chain office. So traditionally, the DOT has a safety mandate, has an operating mandate, has a regulatory mandate, and a grant-making mandate. It does not have a supply chain maximization mandate. The bipartisan infrastructure law changed that. And as a result, as Seaway Administrator, in close coordination with many of my other colleagues at Cabinet at DOT, we're able to work around the globe, especially in the US-Canadian context, to improve the way that goods move not just by water, but across all modes of transportation, with a focus on improving the economy of the US manufacturing sector, the agricultural sector, the energy sector, and indeed the construction sector. This was an important exercise because we were able to not only improve the movement of goods from a safety perspective, certainly in the US-Canadian context, but to lay the ground stones for something that is occurring now, which is the critically important reevaluation of the US-Mexico and Canada agreement, the new NAFTA or USMCA. This July, those renegotiations will formally commence, but we know that diplomatic conversations are currently occurring between many of the three parties in sort of one-to-one context in Ottawa, in DC, and in Mexico City. So I would prognosticate that a lot of the supply chain fluidity work that we were able to do in the Biden administration will carry forward into the Trump administration, is certainly with so much on the table with the USMCA negotiations taking place. Sharing of data, perhaps a interesting way to think about government, but I was not shocked, but a little bit surprised by just the amount of data siloing even within the US government, or the sharing between state and federal governments, let alone the sharing of safety and important operating data between two governments that work hand in hand, like the US and Canada. I have seen firsthand, both as port director and as Seaway administrator, that freight, its movement, and its safety can fail when data is heavily siloed. So we spent a significant amount of time and effort integrating information into formal agreements on both sides of the border, improving the governance and the process in which data is shared in a meaningful and useful way. You hear me talk a lot, both as a port director, about the importance of dock wall infrastructure. But one thing I would submit for all of you to consider is that data, especially in this day and age where we look to AI, when we look to metadata, is another key element of core infrastructure in our economy and in our society. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. I'm not going to lie. The days were long. The work was hard. Many of you that know me know that I was in Washington, D.C. Because my husband and I were in the middle of the adoption process, my husband stayed here in Milwaukee. So we were living apart, and I was able to come home a day or two every couple weeks. But even with that challenge and that commitment that my family had to service in the administration, there were moments that were particularly difficult. Certainly the collapse of the Key Bridge in Baltimore was one. And I'm proud to say that the whole of government effort that I was personally witness to, that Secretary Pete led and others led, like Maryland Governor Moore and countless others, were quite frankly heroic. It was a best case example of what government can and should do in partnership, local, state, federal, working together. But a fair question is, what did that mean from a Great Lakes perspective? The Key Bridge was not in my direct purview. There was other members of cabinet at DOT that did work on the Key Bridge day to day, hour by hour for weeks and months. For me, many of the cargoes that you would have seen moving into Baltimore, we did shift to Great Lakes ports temporarily to make sure that the US economy didn't slow. So we all had our own piece in that puzzle as a whole of government response to what was a very difficult situation. You've already heard me talk about it, but one of the hallmarks of our approach was certainly providing the infrastructure and the opportunity. When you connect infrastructure and you connect supply chains, and you connect freight, and you connect data and safety, what does that mean from the Great Lakes? Well, for all of the ports on the Great Lakes, Milwaukee and beyond, a heartbeat of this economy has long been, especially from the industrial heartland, exporting of farmers' goods, agricultural goods, and working on agricultural projects hand in foot with Wisconsin farmers and countless other farmers from the Great Lakes states was a true honor of the work. How are we seeking to improve the movement of agricultural commodities out of the Great Lakes? Containerization is one. Right now on the Great Lakes for the last 70 years, only 2 ports are approved by the US government to operate containers. If you go to the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, or Long Beach, Los Angeles, or Savannah, or Houston, you are going to see hundreds of thousands of containers. Right now in the Great Lakes, only Cleveland and Duluth are approved to handle containers because the economies for containerization in a market as niche as the Great Lakes is much more challenging. So part of my effort was to expand the amount of approved containers on the Great Lakes. And we're excited to see this year 2 other ports finally coming online. The Port of Burns Harbor, Indiana, which is immediately east of downtown Chicago, and the Port of Monroe, Michigan, which is due south of Detroit. Another way that we seek to increase not only the export of agricultural commodities, but the overall economic vibrancy and resiliency of the Great Lakes region was through securing new international partnerships. And as administrator, I proudly represented the administration in negotiating 4 new trade development agreements, which remain under force today. Showing commitment from ports abroad in their desire to work in and around the Great Lakes with US and Canadian Great Lakes ports. And I will say those ports included the port of Bilbao in Spain, the ports of Niedersachsen in Germany, it's a bit of a port collective, the port of Genoa in Italy, and of course, one of the most important ports from a Great Lakes economic perspective overall, Antwerp in Belgium. I also represented the US government in diplomatic negotiations with a port at the far bottom of this earth, Punta Arenas in Chile, which is way, 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 way down there. But it's interesting because a lot of what we would do with these international agreements is talk about some of the issues that are going to change our economic and environmental landscape, and to secure like-minded international partners to make sure that we can continue to operate in a mature global fashion going forward. What are the tools that we need to decarbonize? Well, you need biofuels, you need alternative fuels. What are the critical minerals that we need to have in order to move towards more electric and battery sources across all of our infrastructure? That is what many of these international agreements that I was able to negotiate and sign as administrator laid the foundation for. And to the best of my knowledge, all four are currently still very much in practice under the Trump administration, and for that I'm particularly grateful. And of course, you can't talk about the Great Lakes these days without talking about the cruise ships. And I will remind everyone in this room that in 2019, when I first presented before you, I said the cruise ships are coming. And there was many of you that said, good luck, Adam. But here we are today. It's so amazing. In Milwaukee alone, this year, the mayor talked about it in his State of City address yesterday. Something like 64 cruise calls will occur in 2026. 20,000 international passengers are going to come on cruise ships to Milwaukee alone. In and across the Great Lakes region, we anticipate 175,000 cruise passengers contributing to a new international cruise economy on the Great Lakes of almost over $300 million per year. This is a market that did not exist in Milwaukee and barely existed on the Great Lakes in 2021. And I do want to thank all of you for your support and encouragement, because I know many of you have interfaced with this developing economy in our region, in our city, and it's a much of a Rotary success story as it is a port success story, as it is a Milwaukee success story, a Wisconsin success story, and a Great Lakes success story. So thank you for that indeed. What am I up to now? I'm duty bound by paycheck to let you know what Ramble is. For me, the one thing AJ, my husband, said to me after we lived apart for 3 years, while also raising our newborn, was find a job that brings you back to Milwaukee. Come home, it's time. And I was lucky to, and my goal was to find a place that I could continue the conversation around decarbonization and sustainability in transportation infrastructure. Ramble is a Danish-owned company. We are headquartered in Copenhagen with just about 20,000 employees now globally. And we are a full services architecture, engineering, and sustainability consultancy with an office here in Milwaukee on 2nd and Florida. If you look at Ramble overall from a global perspective, we are hitting just about every market through our global services agreements and our work here in the US, which includes about 2,000 of those 25,000 employees, give or take. And I should add, our Milwaukee office has about 150 of those. So I'm particularly proud to lead up our transportation and infrastructure practice now at Ramble in the US and Canada as a partner for sustainable change. My decision to come to Ramble was because this ethos of climate adaptation and responsibility in our work to decarbonization, to the resiliency of our society, and to supporting biodiversity and ecosystem expansion within and across every transport and infrastructure decision is something that will continue to drive my work now back here in Milwaukee with all of you as a Rotarian and at Ramble. So thank you for your time and attention, and I welcome all of your questions. Thank you.
Adam, thanks so much for speaking today. You're so cool. Anybody that has a question, if you want to line up right here, questions are 30 seconds. I've got my little timer and we are ready to go.
Thank you for your great presentation. I'm Teresa Esser, and when I think of the Port of Milwaukee, I think of free trade zones, or now I understand they're called foreign trade zones. And I looked up what that meant. A foreign trade zone can defer, reduce, or eliminate customs duties. So my question is, can free trade zones or foreign trade zones protect us from the impact of tariffs? And is that why the farmers are running their agricultural goods through Jones Island?
So I'll break up that answer in two pieces. So foreign trade zones are a program of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And in every foreign trade zone, a public authority, like in this case, the Port of Milwaukee, operates the foreign trade zone on behalf of the U.S. Department of Commerce. So the answer is, it is not a block from tariffs. If a foreign trade zone is approved for use by a local manufacturer, and the port helps implement that, you can move cargo in and out of that foreign trade zone in a duty-free way temporarily. I should add that I am not an FTZ expert, but the port does have a gentleman named Corey Garceau here in Milwaukee who works with area manufacturers to leverage their utilization of FTZs. And I should say that a predecessor of Corey's work, the former foreign trade zone representative for the Port of Milwaukee, is Nick Grahovic, this tall redhead right here. So if anyone wants to talk FTZ, you can grab Nick, but it's been about 10 years since he's worked FTZs. And then why are people moving exports, egg exports out of Milwaukee? The terminal was built specifically to maximize the supply chains that exist in Wisconsin. Milwaukee, for example, the port is serviced by 2 Class 1 railroads. Many ports are only serviced by 1 Class 1 railroad, for example. So when the DeLong company decided to build a $40 million terminal, they needed access to where cargo can move from a truck to a ship, from a train to a truck, or from a train to a ship and vice versa. That's essentially what a port is, where all modes of cargo, modes of transportation come together for the movement and efficient handling of cargo so it can move from place to place. Ultimately, the terminal here in Milwaukee reduces the cost and that last mile challenge of getting those cargoes from Milwaukee, from farmers in Wisconsin, to its destinations worldwide. I think that terminal saw cargo move to 10 different countries last year, for example. Sir.
Thanks and congratulations for all your work in Washington here, quite impressive. You used the term geopolitical climate in your conversations, and if you did a box checking, you'd a plus for Trump, a plus, a negative for Trump, et cetera, down your list. You had some successes and failures. We hear on the news, of course, that we're almost at war with Canada. Give us your assessment of what the situation really is between us and Canada on a technical level and on a political level. Mm-hmm.
I will say, out of respect, I try hard. Obviously, I'm a registered Democrat. I proudly served in the Biden administration, so you can assume some of my biases. But I will say this. As a practitioner of U.S. and Canadian diplomacy over the last 20 years, the situation unfolding is incredibly dire. The relationship between the U.S. and Canada at all levels of government was incredibly special. When I was administrator, the Canadian Seaway shut down for 7 days because of a union disagreement. That had not happened in decades. The only reason why U.S. and Canadian ports didn't shut down was because the personal, professional, formal and informal diplomatic channels that were available to us between the governments were available and open and working to make sure that service came back on the Canadian side of the Seaway and that the economies of the Great Lakes were not disrupted. Those relationships have been altered by some of the language that we've seen from the current administration. Antagonistic language, like referring to Canada as the 51st state. calling the new Prime Minister of Canada a governor as opposed to a prime minister, his equal in nation-state governance. These are things that are impacting the work and the trust and the methodologies and ways that these two countries, who are used to working hand in hand, now do that work. I will say, especially now in the governance roles that I practice on the Great Lakes Commission and Sewer PAC and others, you can see that those relationships at different levels of government and at different levels of industry continue to be practiced and continue to flourish. That is what we will count on to make sure that what is a hundreds of years old partnership between these two countries continues forward. Thank you.
Thanks for your presentation, and what a marvelous, marvelous creation the Seaway is. One of the downsides, though, that is over the years we've seen invasive species come through as a result of the ballast water being discharged. Could you tell us what happened on your watch and what the state of the Great Lakes are given the continued shipment through the Seaway and the ballast water that continues to be discharged?
A fair question, and one that I get 10 times a day as a former Seaway administrator. One of the things that I did as Seaway administrator, I will tell you, is as required, we'll call it recommended, lightly required reading, was that everyone working with me at the Seaway, I encouraged them to read Dan Egan's Death and Life on the Great Lakes, which is an important book in examining some of the challenging environmental legacies of the opening of the Seaway and what maritime transportation has meant for the ecology of the Great Lakes. I am very proud that over the last 15 years, let me step back. 15 years ago, the US and Canadian governments came together and implemented what is a 100% required rule for no ballast water exchange on the Great Lakes. Any vessel that comes into the Great Lakes that goes through the Seaway is jointly, goes through a safety, security, and ballast water inspection at the Port of Montreal. The ballast water tanks are capped, and there's no exchange has been allowed for over 15 years. And as a result, there's been no new invasive species introduced into the Great Lakes since that time. I can't speak for the decisions that were made in 1959, but what I can tell you is maintaining that 100% compliance. In my time, when I was the leader responsible for that proud tradition, we did maintain that 100% compliance. I will say, however, that we do need to continue looking at the Army Corps' work on the Mississippi River and the Chicago locks to make sure that what has been the long envisioned federal and state investment to not only keep tug and barge traffic going on the Mississippi River, but to prevent the introduction of Asian carp or other carp-related species into the Great Lakes from the Mississippi River system is a work that still continues. The Corps has made tremendous progress, but there's still work to do on that front. Thank you.
Good afternoon. You've given us some really interesting information about efforts toward carbon neutrality and sustainability, which sort of implicates the impact of Great Lakes commerce on the climate. I'm curious about to what extent you and the people working in your world are thinking about the impacts of climate change on Great Lakes commerce, things like water levels and other things. Is that something that you think about right now?
Yes. So one thing that we can clearly see, and many of you remember the January 2020 storm that flooded the Port of Milwaukee, several $1 million in damage overnight. What we know is that climate change is dramatically changing the Great Lakes in real time. Across the ecological history of the Great Lakes, what you would safely see is raising and lowering of lake levels is nothing new. That is a naturally occurring phenomenon. But normally that change from high highs to low lows would take across a time period of 20, 30, 40 years. Now we're seeing those shifts taking place in the span of 5 or 6 or 7 years. So to your point about what does that mean from an operational preparedness perspective, from an infrastructure investment perspective, from a capital asset renewal perspective, if I were a port director today, or indeed those ports that I'm advising in my current role at Ramble, or the story that I would tell as Seaway Administrator, is we can't ignore the fact that these lake levels are dramatically changing. I'll make two interesting sort of government insights that you may not have heard of. One of my favorite scientific phenomenon on the Great Lakes is called crustal rebound. The Great Lakes are basically imprints in our Earth because of glaciation. But across millennia, the Great Lakes are going to rise every year by millimeters. The bottom of the Great Lakes continues to increase. The US government is due, in fact overdue, I forget, every 20 years the US government is supposed to formally designate what the average level of water in the Great Lakes is based off of a recalculation of crustal rebound. The US government and the Canadian government have been unable to successfully do that, I believe, since 1984. I tried to make sure that that would be something that our colleagues at NOAA could undertake. To the best of my knowledge, a comprehensive update is still under consideration. So the other element, I had another fun ecological fact about the Great Lakes. It'll come back to me, but next question, please. Sorry about that.
Okay, this is our last question.
Just with the age of the locks and the setup and the size of ships that have grown through the years, are these locks prepared to keep going forward for a long time, or do they need to be expanded to take on the bigger ships?
So multi-part answer. The Seaway will not be expanded. I cannot imagine that these 15 locks will be expanded in size. For right now, the Army Corps of Engineers is making a much-needed improvement and rehabilitation new lock at Sault Ste. Marie in Michigan. That Army Corps-operated lock, indeed the 16th lock of the Great Lakes region, is costing somewhere between $2 and $4 billion just for one lock. That required 30 years of congressional review and a 10-year bipartisan funding package just for one lock. So the governance and the financing to do 15 additional locks between the US and Canada, two countries that aren't exactly happy with each other right now, it's not going to happen in our lifetime. What does that mean from an international commerce perspective? When you look at the world's largest shipping ships now are built to maximize the size of the recently increased Panama Canal. These vessels are called post-Panamax vessels. These are the ships that can hold 10,000 containers on a load. You're never going to see those vessels in the Great Lakes. There's a unique vessel size in international parlance called Seaway Max or handy-size vessels. These are the smallest vessels that can fit, that are safe to go across the world's oceans and come into the St. Lawrence Seaway and to US and Canadian Great Lakes ports. We will continue to see these smaller vessels come through the Seaway in perpetuity. How does that infrastructure that's been operating for 70 years continue to go? I can tell you going through congressional budget approval process is a complicated, arduous, and fun process, but the one thing that we've been able to do, in addition to the Seaway's operating budget, is sustain what we call the Seaway Infrastructure Program, or SIP. Congress, for the last 10 years, has given an additional $20 million to the Seaway to make sure that our locks are rehabilitated. They close in January. The US government spends $20 million in reinvigorating that 70-year-old infrastructure, and then those locks take in ships from around the world from about March 22nd until January 5th each year. So that is the investment protocol to keep 70-year-old infrastructure operating safely. Thank you all for your time and attention. Ken?